welcome back to another episode of tier listing Duel Commanders. And today we're having a look at the green cards. As always, I'm here with Samuel.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so we've had, I think, very positive feedback to our last couple of tier lists of the monocolored commanders.
Definitely.
And looking at this list, I think anyone looking at it will be able to recognize two commanders that are currently being played a lot, one commander that used to be played quite a bit, and two more that are on the fringes, I would say. So this is between the colors, there's always differences. Blue was very full in terms of how many are viable. Red, on the other hand, was not as full, and black also had some I think a bit of trouble filling up the list. But yeah, this one, I think this is the some of the commanders we're looking at today have the strongest place in the meta out of all of the monocolored tier lists, which also leads us to one video that will be coming up eventually. Once we're done with all the monocolors, we are going to have a look at the all of the monocolored decks, all of the best monocolored decks in the context of the format and putting them in a tier list. I think that's a kind of good way to wrap that up. And yeah, so look forward to that. If you enjoy this content, give us a like, give us a follow, give us a follow, a subscribe, and yeah, I think that leads us to our first commander. If you
Yeah. Yeah, we're talking about Azusa in the very first place. A card that I always claimed is on its own not really good, but it's rather the 99 that makes it so good, and I still stand my ground. I think by design, Azusa is a card that, yeah, as it's written on the card, it needs useful lands, it needs to have useful draws, useful mulligans whatsoever in order to do work, right? And if we look at the development of this deck, it started as, I wouldn't say a meme deck, but rather something that people just wanted to play mono green big spells, mostly Eldrazi's. And the lands, and especially the green lands, shell developed further and further. And there were also a couple of very good pilots from the French scene. Yeah, I would say primarily that developed this list to a very, very solid deck.
yeah,
Nonetheless, there's lots of variation included. You've picked it up a couple of times on the channel. You also enjoyed playing the deck, if I
yeah,
recall correctly. I
yeah,
also enjoy playing against it. I also picked it up a couple of times. It is enjoyable to play. It's not boring. It doesn't get boring. There's quite some decision making involved. And due to the lands toolbox that you have available these days, it's quite a good deck against, yeah, a couple of synergies, I would say. And if you're a seasoned pilot, if you invest some time into playing Azusa, you can have a good chance against most of the current decks in the format. I would personally place it in A tier. It's still a very solid lands commander, and we do see some Azusas here and there. As you said, it's a bit overshadowed by Lumra for other reasons. We will talk about that later. Mm, What I find very interesting is the different ways the deck is trying to tackle the metagame. For example, recently the lists added Trinisphere effects, or like Bone of Amethyst, I think, and all these Staxy artifacts in order to tackle the pace that the deck was a bit suffering of or couldn't really keep up with.
mhm,
That was definitely an interesting development. But I also think you are right. We see much more Lumra these days. for reasons that we will discuss later. Nonetheless, as I said, every now and then we still see Azusa, and I think it's a very decent choice if you are looking to play an interactive Marine deck in Duel Commander, I would say.
Yeah, I think I I don't quite agree in
Mhm.
terms of your placement. I would put it more in B tier. I think it's a bit slower than you need to be at the moment, but maybe that's just because I haven't played against the deck in a while. I think this is one of the decks that has, I think, the most history in the format.
Yeah, for
When
sure.
you look at it kind of in context, there was a time when I think it was one of the top contenders before Wasteland got banned. It was the deck that had the most ability to loop Wasteland and have access to Wasteland. There were turns and situations that the deck could assemble with a Crucible of Worlds, with a Ramen Up Excavator, and tutors for the Ramen Up Excavator and the Wasteland, where on turn 3 or 4, you you had the ability to Wasteland the opponent 3 or 4 times. And that is definitely not something that most decks in the metagame could come back from. There were some, I would say, more broken things going on in the format at other in other decks as well. But there was definitely a time when, for example, like Field of Ruin and Wasteland got banned in the same ban wave, which means that there was an Azusa deck for a little bit that you could play Field of Ruin and Wasteland in, and that is an incredibly powerful deck that used to be
Field of the
uh,
Dead, you mean? Field of the Dead, not Field
Field
of
of the
Ruin.
Dead, not Field of Ruin. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And I think since then the deck has kind of been on a, I would say, downward trend, definitely. And with the printing of Lumra, most of what it's trying to do and most of what its good draws do have been sort of outclassed, because you interact with it on the same axis as that you interact with Lumra on, I would say, most of the time. And Lumra just does much better when not interacted with, I would say. But maybe I could be proven wrong there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit on the same page as I haven't faced Azusa for quite some time. I think within the last 6 months, I played it once with Tifa, and the player told me up front that Tifa would be an excellent matchup, and I was like, I have no idea why that should be the case because you have exactly the same tools as Luma does. To be honest, you should play exactly the same amount of tutors also, um, maybe one or two more, but not that much. The result was more or less the same, but so I haven't really faced it. I don't have any previous experience. I think what you're definitely right. The old variant featuring the Wasteland loop was definitely the most powerful. And when I said that the card itself was not necessarily designed to be a commander, I was not talking about that time because at that time you could just go for this Wasteland abusing and you would win many games, right? And the games that you could not win by doing that were either against mono blue control, which was probably a tricky matchup, but even back then there were a couple of utility lands, or you would face mono red, for which you had Mace and Glacier Chasm. These days, I think the development the deck took towards boarding the Eldrazi's, going for spells that would come with an additional effect, even if they are countered, as it's the case with the Eldrazi's. I think this is something that gave Azusa a very big boost to not be fully reliant on Primeval Titan coming down, but also having the option to search for those Eldrazi's due to the Eye of Eugen, but also, get the triggers. And I think it was Modern Horizons 3, that brought the second Emrakul, which gave
Yep.
another option against aggressive decks by gaining control of all the creatures. So that was definitely a big thing. I think it's still a very solid lens deck. As I just said, it's overshadowed. I'm a bit hesitant whether or not to put it in AOB. Maybe you're right. Maybe we can just agree that it sits somewhere in between A and B.
Yeah,
And if we have, yeah, if we have any of those viewers who are passionate and seasoned Azusa players, agree or disagree, feel free to hit that in the comments and talk about that with us. Let's talk about the next card, a commander that was banned for years because people thought it would be way too broken, simply because of the mana advantage that Rofellos provides. It is released for, I think, a year now, right? It was unbanned with Baral, Asmo, and Ezio. I think that was and even Akiri. I'm not sure if it was the same announcement, but it was like a bigger announcement, and Rofellos was part of that. People toyed with it, completely unsuccessful, because the requirements to make this deck work are very, very high.
yeah,
Amongst all these decks, I would definitely put it in D tier. Not only because it's not showing up, but
absolutely.
simply because it's just so hard to make it work.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think the initial thoughts that we had when it got unbanned were kind of proven to be correct. Putting together a list that at the same time is trying to, be a good green deck by ramping and putting stuff on the board while also having like being able to utilize the mana advantage that Rofellos, when he resolves and you get to untap with him, would provide, is just a too tricky of a conundrum.
Yep.
Because if you try to protect him, then suddenly you aren't like you're waiting too long with him for that to have access to have impact. If you just try to get him on the board turn 2 and then try to cast something for 6 turn 3, you run into the problem that he's probably going to get removed. There are every removal spell in the format kills a Rofellos, which is just, yeah, it's just not good enough. I, there's not that much more to say about it.
I think so too. And as I said, we have seen maybe a handful of lists, and none of them really did anything right, because the restrictions are just too crazy. And after all, it's one of those cards that people had like this idea, because back then, when the concept of tempo in Magic was looking much different, this might have been a very, very good card. Also because with time, the amount of non-basic lands, even in a mono-colored deck you would add, became much higher, right? Because they added so many good utility lands. Talking about green decks, we have Bosejo, we have Shifting Woodlands, etc., etc. Back then, you just had a higher forest count, which makes Rofellos better. And, Magic was played much slower after all, which meant that it was good to produce potentially 6 mana on turn 3. And there was also no fatal push around and cut downs and whatsoever. Of course, there were some bolts and lava dots and blah, 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 but was restricted to a certain color. White also hadn't had access to static prisons, steam rips, and whatsoever, right? So Magic just changed, and Rofellos is
Yep,
a card that does not fit the today's standards anymore, I would say.
I agree.
Okay, going over to the big bear in the room, the serious card. I would directly put this guy in S tier. We talked about Lumra already when we evaluated the top 20 decks for the metagame. If you haven't checked that video, I will link it in the description. I will also link it right now. You can check it out. We talked about the top 20 decks for Duel Commander, and Lumra also went in S tier because it is currently, as you said at the beginning, it is one of the best decks, and it definitely is. It's very tricky to pilot. You have to invest some time in order to get used to your lines. There's lots of depth in piloting this deck, which is something that I would say, especially more experienced players are always looking for to play a deck for a longer time that benefits good decision making.
Yep.
And this is exactly this kind of pile. You have so many angles to interact with different types of strategies. And as you said, it has everything that Azusa has, just better. You know, you have Azusa does not have the I win combo button. Lumra does have that.
Yep.
It's certainly something that I would say most decks have that in Duel Commander these days. If you don't have that, you have a very good reason for not having it. But if I just think about it, even like Armageddon and White Winnie decks is some kind of a soft combo, right? So it's quite common to have that feature, and Lumra has it by nature. For Azusa, it's very hard to come by with that. You
Yep.
have probably more thoughts than I do because you also played the deck a couple of times, and I only played against it, but I know of its power. We see it. It's everywhere around. We cast plenty of games with the bear. It never gets boring. Even these days, we saw some Sandman swaps, and that's interesting already that you have the option to swap. Of course, that comes with the quality of the swaps themselves, but still makes the deck even more resilient against certain matchups, right?
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm absolutely with you that Lumra is an S tier deck. I don't know if it's live yet, but we recorded gameplay of Lumra versus Emery, and that felt a little hopeless. I think there's definitely good draws on the Lumra side, but I think something that is easy to forget because there are very few decks that actually get to play those cards is cards like Winter Orb, Winter Moon, and Tanglewire are incredibly powerful and don't see as much play in Duel Commander now as they once did, and they are really good answers to a Lumra or an Azusa.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is an aspect that I think gets a little undervalued sometimes, but it comes down to the fact that a lot of commanders that have potential with those cards end up getting banned because of how strong those interactions are.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, by the time this tier list comes out, people have seen the match against Lumra already with Emery, and from my experience, the matchup is good because I have counter magic against the bear, and as you said, I have the stacks artifacts to tackle your land base. Gives you a lot of time to build up your own game plan. While mono green almost has nothing to interact with what Emery is doing.
Yep.
So that's definitely true. But apart from that, maybe Emery belongs to the less favored matchups. Still, definitely something Lumra can win. Depends a bit on the odds, also on Emery's side. But
Yep.
overall, very, very solid deck
Absolutely.
against, as I said, against almost all strategies. And there are many people that say, well, if we ever get rid of Spider Man, then Lumra will likely take its slot. Not in terms of popularity, because, as I said, it is a deck that is very tricky to pilot correctly. It has a very specific play style, a very specific card pool, something that not everyone is used to play, and also something that not everyone wants to play.
I agree.
So it will definitely. I mean, is it tempo is definitely a much more popular archetype than mono green lens is. I would say, especially with the amulet lines and stuff, it attracts people that had fun with that in modern or still have fun with that in modern, and they want to keep on in Duel Commander. But apart from that, in terms of power, it is definitely a very, very, very strong card and very few options to interact with that game plan. Apart from, of course, countering spells. But when we talk about the other four colors and the various archetypes that are floating around, they have limited options to deal with Lumra, and that makes it very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up, we talk about
We have
Tifa.
Yeah, this is a commander that you have put quite a lot of time into,
Yeah.
and I think it's a very cool deck. It's not that fun to play against, but I think very fun to play. And it's I think it's very safely in A tier. I think it might I I think it's not quite resilient enough to be in S tier. I think it's gonna struggle sometimes against too much interaction,
Yeah.
which and the quality of the 99 is pretty low. So you are often, if you're you're very mulligan dependent, and if your hands don't come together quite right, then suddenly you have just a horrible pile of cards that you think you're looking at cards and thinking, what am I even playing here? But when everything goes right, you're also thinking, oh, I just did 48 damage to my opponent. So there's kind of two sides of the coin, and yeah, I think Tifa's pretty safely in A tier.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very strong deck. Has a very straightforward plan, as you said, against most decks. It gets interesting once you face the matchups that are not that easy to win. Obviously, it's pretty easy to run down a Yoshi or run down a Slamfoot and stuff like this, right? Because usually, on average, those decks have very little resistance against your commander. And by the time they have that, you have your protection spell available against decks that feature counter magic. It gets a bit trickier. So Tazigor is an interesting matchup that is a bit trickier to beat. Still, from my experience, in favor of Tifa. What is extremely rough is something like Spider-Man, because Spider-Man has lots of counter magic and lots of interaction. And these matchups are very, very interesting to play. And I think the list definitely developed to more resilience in that regards to to tackle those matchups a bit better. There's not that much to tune, but there are a couple of inclusions you can make in order to make the matchups a bit better. So right now, in comparison to, I would say, half a year ago, I played it in September and January last year, and I made first place in Strasbourg 2 times. And yeah, it felt like you were just doing your things. But I also have to say, I played back then, the first tournament, I played against lots of Thrasios combo decks, and this deck is just faster than Thrasios is. I played against Slimefoot, and I think I faced 2 times control. And against control, you have to be a bit lucky. If you find your friends at Bellow, you can protect that, or your Allosaurus Shepherd, you have a good time against control too. So yeah, and the second time it was a bit more mixed, but Spider-Man was definitely a problem. If you don't face 5 Spider-Mans, 4 Spider-Mans actually, as I did in Prague, then life is looking good.
Yeah.
What I like about the deck is that it is simple to understand, simple to play. I wouldn't say hard to master, but harder to master than you'd think. And it's very cheap, so it's a very good deck for beginners to, if you say you want to play mono green, but you don't want to spend a couple of $100 for Azusa or Lumra because some of those lands are a bit more expensive, and you
Yeah,
just want to
City
have
of
a simple,
Traders.
exactly, city and a bunch more,
Yeah.
and you just want to play a very straightforward game plan. Don't think too much. Then Tifa is a very good deck to start, I would say, and explore the format. Also, for tournaments, it's very beneficial in terms of saving time. Most of your best of threes take like 30 minutes max, so you have lots of time to eat in between and rest and relax and whatsoever. I like it a lot. I would also agree it's not good enough currently to be an S tier. I would put it in A tier, but it sits there quite well, I would say.
Yeah.
Last but not least, we have a newly added card from the Marvel set, which is something that I was not actually having an eye on when we talked about the spoilers and or had when we had like the Marvel review. I mean,
Yeah.
the effect is okay, kind of cool, but not too relevant, I would say. Um, it's definitely not a card that you would put in any of these other commanders, since the card has to stick and then your commander has to enter in order for you to become the monarch. If you play it as your commander, then you directly get the monarch. My problem with this card, and that's why I would put it in C tier, max B tier, but I never see a world in which this card would be any better than Azusa, is because the green pool, the average green pool for a strategy like this is very cute. It has very little room of interaction. And, drawing a card is something that I would say maybe 5 years ago, this card would have been really, really good. These days, let's compare it to White Plume. Initiative was brutal on turn 2. Getting the
Yeah.
Monarch, yeah, it's not bad, but we're talking mono green. And there's only so much pressure that a deck like that could provide that I don't really think it's something to be scared of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has you played Bristly Bill for a little bit before Tifa came out,
Yeah, there was a meme deck,
and
but yeah,
and it it has the ability to play those cards as well to have a sort of a +1/+1 counter sub theme. And for example, putting 2 counters on a walking ballista or a hangerback walker can be pretty good. Then being able to play cheap cards and rely on the monarch to keep refueling you, and being a green deck, making you sort of be able to have quite a lot of a good ability to keep the monarch, I think is something to think about. But overall, this deck does not have a strong enough kind of central game plan, I would say, to match what the other cards in our tier list are doing.
exactly.
So it's a fun idea to play around with, and I think many of us that have been playing for a while remember when there were cards like Palace Jailer being played a lot. I'm not sure if that's still being played in Felia,
It
but
is.
yeah, there was definitely a time when there was a lot of sort of like partner decks as well that I think even the Thrasios Tumnar combo decks would often still include a Palace Jailer because at the time that card was just so good.
Exactly, yeah.
And anyone playing against Aragorn also knows that being locked against an opponent that has the Monarch can be just a hopeless wall to kind of come up against. But Aragorn definitely does the Monarch better than a 3/3 reach that puts counters on things. So yeah, I think this is an interesting card, but not quite there.
Yeah, definitely. The to sum it up on this card, I think the the game plan that this deck is or this commander is trying to go for is just too cute. Like the green mid range plan is nothing that you are looking forward to in 2026. That's also why Rofellos was not really successful, apart from being tricky to build and having like these requirements. You know, either you have to be insanely fast, as Tifa is, or you're using the very good green pool, which is mostly connected to being a lands deck. That's what the other 3 decks above do, but she cannot utilize either of this. I mean, maybe you can tweak the deck in either direction, but then you always have to ask a question: why would I not play another of those better commanders instead, right? So, as I said, it's a cool deck to experiment with and a nice idea to tinker with it. But I would say it's nothing serious, to be honest. Okay,
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
with that, we arrived at the end of our mono green tier list. I hope it was interesting for you, insightful. Maybe you, yeah, thought about one or another card to give it a try. Mm, if I would recommend any of those decks, I would seriously recommend you to play either Lumra or Tifa. As I said, Tifa is a budget option. Lumra, for the bit more experienced players, I would say, who are looking for an adventure for the next few months, I would say. Mm, but yeah, overall, that's how we think about those cards. As always, you might agree or disagree. It's very interesting to talk about some of our decisions with you in the comments. Last time when we talked about the blue cards, there were quite a few people disagreeing with us on the Malcolm tiering. If you're curious about blue cards, you can also head over to the previous podcast and check that out. I will also link that here. That's that. Do you have anything to add?
I think you said most of it. I think we these tier lists are always fun. I think they're the most fun when we have like the blue ones where we have there's lots to say about everything, and to some extent it's a bit of a competitive tier list. I think here we have, as I said before, two commanders that are really in there, that really are represented in the metagame, and the rest, they're good to say some words for. I think they deserve to be acknowledged, but I think Tifa and Lumra are definitely the cream of the crop here, and Tifa, as you said, very good budget deck to get into the format with, to learn about what your opponents are doing and how to play against that. And Lumra, if you like difficult combo lines and thinking about how your hands are going to develop over a couple of turns, then I think Lumra's a pretty cool commander to be playing.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want to have some fun at your FNMs, maybe try Nakia or even give Azusa a try. Probably don't try out Rofellos. I would really not recommend to do that. That's how it is. Thanks a lot for tuning in, guys. And we will see each other talking about white cards in the final session of all colors. And then, as Samuel introduced, we will talk about the best of the best in a 6 session.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.